Hello, welcome back to India Today Global. The big news today, of course, is the visit of Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany to India. This is a visit, of course, that was expected to deliver much on things like defense, on trade, on investment, climate change, renewable energy, a relationship in Europe that has turned out to be very important for India is, of course, India's relationship with Germany. And joining me now is Sherry Malhotra, Deputy Director at the Observer Research Foundation, who studies India's relationship with Europe very closely. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us. Could you begin by just explaining what this visit of the German Chancellor means? What significance does it hold for India's foreign policy?
Thank you, Shashank, firstly, for having me on your show. Let me just start by saying that, India and Germany have had a strategic partnership since 2000, but there's been scant attention paid to each other in the past. But I think now we've reached a point where this is fundamentally changing. Chancellor Scholz's current visit to India comes on the heels of the release of the German government's first ever policy paper on India, which is a sort of blueprint to elevate India-Germany bilateral ties. And this focus on India document is very much part of Germany's overall Zeitenwende or turning point since Russia's war on Ukraine, where Germany is also now reassessing its ties with India, looking at India through a more fresh and a more strategic lens, given the backdrop of the tense global geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in, with the war in Ukraine still raging, tensions in the Middle East escalating, and of course China's assertive behavior. And I think precisely because of all this global instability, it's relationships like the India-Germany relationship that have become so important. This is Chancellor Scholz's third visit to India. He traveled to India twice last year for a bilateral state visit in February and also to attend the G20 summit in September. Now he's here to co-chair with Prime Minister Modi the seventh intergovernmental consultations between India and Germany. And in my assessment, I think there are three key focus areas of this visit, namely trade, security and defense, and migration and mobility.
Sure.
And I'm willing to talk more on these areas individually if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into that, right? Because of course, on defense, there's this much wanted proposal for TKMS to work with India's Navy on cutting edge submarines. On migration, there's of course conversations about having more Indian talent move to Germany. It's of course needed. Large numbers of young, skilled migrants coming into the German economy. So a lot of conversations there. So could you lay out for us what you think are the big issues that Germany and India will be looking at in this next couple of days in the summit?
Well, you mentioned migration. I think that is a really important point. Germany has an aging society. Its workforce is expected to keep shrinking. It has a huge shortage when it comes to skilled manpower. In fact, I was reading that Germany needs around 400,000 workers from abroad per year to keep its economy functioning. And I think this is where India comes in with its ability to plug this gap because India, of course, has amongst the world's largest young populations. Many of whom are technically skilled, but also struggling at the same time to find jobs in India. So Germany wants to attract skilled labor, which is why Germany's labor minister is also part of this delegation currently visiting India. In 2022, India and Germany signed the Migration and Mobility Partnership Agreement, which I think is a win-win for both India and Germany. Already today, Prime Minister Modi has said that there's been an announcement that Germany has decided to increase visas for skilled Indians from 20,000 to 90,000. So that's a huge deal, I think. When it comes to things like education as well, Germany has emerged as a top destination for Indian students. Germany already hosts 50,000 Indian students, which is in fact the largest non-German group of students studying at German universities. So this is also going to be a part of the agenda. So there are lots of complementarities in terms of migration, what India can bring, talented workers, and what the German economy needs.
Right. Let's talk about defense as well, right? There's this, the big proposal, of course, was the Indian Navy's need for air-independent propulsion submarines. These are, of course, a major focus area of interest. There's, of course, a competing proposal from Spain. Of course, Spain's president is also going to be landing up in India very shortly. And the idea is that ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, which is TKMS, which is a big German firm, is interested in that project. And we know that Germany and Spain are competing for this. So tell us a little bit about the defense side of the equation between India and Germany. We very recently, even here at India Today, had the chief of the German Air Force, come in for an interview. So tell us a little bit about this defense engagement between India and Germany, and if you could, something about this big naval deal that people are looking at right now.
Well, Shashank, as you rightly said, there's been a rise in Indo-German defense engagements in recent years. During this visit as well, there is a goal to further strengthen military cooperation. Germany's been simplifying license agreements to sell military equipment to India, which is a huge deal, given Germany's stringent past policies on arms exports, and of course, given Germany's overall history. And again, I think this is part of the wider German Zeitenwende and rethinking when it comes to matters of security. Germany's also last year released its national security strategy, which involves boosting German defense spending to 2% of GDP, and a lot of other changes when it comes to Germany's security policy. When it comes to the naval cooperation that you mentioned, last year India and Germany signed a deal to jointly build 6 conventional submarines. There's a German company bidding for this. As you rightly pointed out, the Spanish Prime Minister is also visiting, and this will be on the agenda there too. But there is this wider goal of supporting India's goals for indigenous defense production and modernization, but also helping to reduce India's arms dependency on Russia. There's also, of course, the wider goal of maintaining stability in the Indo-Pacific region, which is home to critical trade routes linking Asia to Europe. And we know that Indo-German strategic interests have been converging in this region. Both countries want to see a free and open Indo-Pacific. In 2020, if you go back, Germany had actually released its Indo-Pacific strategy, along with a lot of other EU member states and the EU itself. I believe Chancellor Scholz is also due to visit Goa, where the German frigate will be making a port call as part of Germany's wider Indo-Pacific deployments to enhance maritime security in the region. I just read today, in fact, that Germany also intends to post a liaison officer at the Indian Navy's Information Fusion Center in Gurgaon. I think this is something that the UK has done as well. So I think all in all, there's a lot happening on the defense front as well. In general, I'd like to add that, one would have thought that with the Russia-Ukraine war, the Indo-Pacific region would very much be subordinated in the European calculus. But I think quite the opposite has happened. In fact, European countries like Germany are increasingly linking security and stability in the Euro-Atlantic theater to security and stability in the Indo-Pacific theater. And this is what has, opened up opportunities for India-Europe security cooperation.
Right. Could I ask you how, you talked about the Indo-Pacific, you talk about how these two theaters are looking at each other more. Could I ask you, in terms of the question of China, how does Germany think about China and its place in its foreign policy? Is there some shared concern about the Chinese foreign policy between India and Germany that is driving some of the strategic cooperation?
I think it's foreign policy, Germany's own foreign policy, which as a result of China's assertive behavior is changing. And the China question actually looms really large when it comes to German, both foreign and trade policy. Russia's war on Ukraine, but also China's assertive posturing, they've brought into question Germany's previous policy of Wandel Durch Handel, which was formulated by the previous Chancellor Angela Merkel. This has prompted a deep rethink of Germany's energy and trade dependencies. And I think Chancellor Scholz's trip to India also comes at a crucial time when the German economy is struggling due to the war in Ukraine, Germany's compulsions to end its cheap Russian gas supplies. The EU as well is embroiled in serious trade tensions with China at the moment. It's just voted to impose big tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, to which the Chinese have retaliated with their own tariffs on European products. And this wider EU-China trade war has implications for Germany, which is, of course, the EU's economic powerhouse, and it's also an export-driven economy. And last year, in fact, Germany also released its first China strategy that talks of reducing dependencies, reducing supply chain vulnerabilities. It reflected an overall hardened posture towards China. Germany's been trying to diversify its trade away from China, and in this context, it's showing more and more interest in India in the context of the West overall China +1 strategy. So Germany is looking at India India now as an alternative hub for manufacturing and trade. But I think there's a long way to go in this regard, because even though Germany is India's seventh largest trading partner globally, the largest one in Europe, if you look at the bilateral trade figures, India's trade with Germany is only about $30 billion, whereas China's trade with Germany still stands around $300 billion. So there is this huge scope to increase Indo-German bilateral trade. In many ways, Germany is still seen as the weakest link in the EU's more hawkish China strategy. Chancellor Scholz did make a trip earlier this year to China as well, and that trip really seemed like an attempt, in my opinion, to rebalance trade ties with Beijing rather than carry forward the EU's more assertive message. But I still think, despite Germany's sort of schizophrenia when it comes to China, I think when it comes to India, the signs are very promising.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about the war in Ukraine? This of course, started in February 2022, and there's a lot of conversation then about a different strategic perception in India about the war. Of course, India did not condemn Russia for its invasion. Some conversation or analysis then was that, look, this is going to, at some level, impact our strategic trust with European countries. We're now 2.5 years on, going on 3 years of the conflict beginning. Do you believe that this issue has largely been settled, or in your conversations with European diplomats, do you think this continues to come up, that they would like more support from India on their policy on Ukraine, or do you think that largely the sense is that there is a lot of understanding for India's policy and that it isn't going to change? Your sense of this?
I do think the Europeans would want India to play a more proactive role. I think the question of India's relations with Russia has somewhat, I think the Europeans have understood that India has its own security compulsions. Ever since this war began, and it's going to be 3 years now, India has been effectively articulating its position through dialogue and diplomacy to the Europeans, and the Europeans have also shown a willingness to listen. So I think we moved on from that standpoint. But having said that, I do think Europe would want India to play a more proactive role, which I do think India is actually playing on the sidelines of this war. India's position, even though a lot of people in Europe initially looked at it as a neutral position, now they've come to understand that it's actually a position of proactive neutrality. India's also spoken time and again of the impact of this war on countries in the global south when it comes to food insecurity, etc. So India has made it clear that it's on the side of peace and that it wants this war to end. And I think Europe has respected that fact, but at the same time, we've also come to a conclusion that India, just like Europe has its security interests when it comes to Russia, India has its own security compulsions. We have Pakistan on the western border, we have China on our eastern border. That's not an easy geography to operate in, and I think Europe has tried to understand that aspect.
Understood. Sherry Malhotra, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global, explaining something of the India-Germany visit, Chancellor Scholz's sojourn here in India for a couple of days, as well as some of the agenda on the relationship, whether it is defense, whether it's trade, and on key issues like climate change. Thank you so much, Sherry, for joining us. And thank you so much, viewers, for joining us on India Today Global.
Thank you for having me. Thanks. Bye.